The bells of Lochstube had not yet rung in the new year when the crime announced itself not with a scream or a gunshot, but with absence. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, as Hogmanay revellers drifted home through frost, sharp air, Mrs. Agnes MacLeod knocked on the door of Bray Cottage and received no answer. That alone was not strange. What unsettled her was the light still burning in the back room, and the front door bolted from the inside, just as it had been when she last saw the occupant an hour earlier. Donald Fraser was not a man given to wandering. He was punctual, careful, and deeply attached to routine, especially on Hogmanay. Every year, without fail, he locked his door at 10, poured himself a single whisky, and waited by the radio for the bells. That night should have been no different. Yet by the time Constable Hamish Macbeth arrived, coat flapping, face ruddy from the cold, Donald Fraser had vanished from a locked cottage, leaving behind a fire still warm and a glass of whisky untouched on the table. The room told its story quietly. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. The windows were latched, the chimney narrow and blocked by an old iron grate. The door bolt slid smoothly. It had not been forced. Hamish crouched to examine it anyway, running a finger along the wood. No scratches, no splinters. If Donald had left, he had done so deliberately, or someone had arranged things to look that way. The villagers gathered outside, whispering into scarves. Superintendent Blair arrived soon after, already irritated. Man probably stepped out drunk and fell into a ditch, he declared, stamping snow from his boots. Hogmanay does that to people. Hamish said nothing, his eyes lingering on the whisky glass. It had been poured but not sipped. Donald Fraser never skipped his first sip. Hamish lifted the glass and sniffed. Just whisky, nothing else. He set it down carefully, noticing how it stood slightly off-centre on the table, as if it had been nudged. After being placed there was an odd object on the mantelpiece, a small, blackened brass key, not the sort used for doors, too delicate for that. Hamish picked it up. Warm, recently handled. "What's this for?" he asked. Blair shrugged. "Probably decorative. Old place like this, full of junk." But Hamish was not convinced. Donald Fraser was not a collector of junk. Everything in the cottage had a purpose. He moved slowly through the rest of the rooms. The bedroom was neat, the bed unslept in. The back pantry held sacks of oats and jars of preserves, all in order. Then Hamish noticed the clock on the wall. It had stopped at 12 minutes past midnight. That's when Agnes knocked. Hamish murmured so. Blair snapped. "Clock runs down. Means nothing." Hamish crouched and examined the clock more closely. The weight chain had been deliberately unhooked. Someone had stopped it, outside. The wind carried the last echoes of laughter from the village square. Hogmanay should have been loud, chaotic. Yet here was a crime wrapped in stillness. Hamish stepped back into the sitting-room and looked again at the fire. The logs were burned down evenly, as if tended carefully. Donald would not have left a fire unattended. Locked room, Blair said with satisfaction. Means no crime, or a clever one, Hamish replied quietly. He walked to the back door and opened it, letting in a gust of cold air. Snow lay untouched beyond the threshold. No footprints leading away, no footprints leading in. If Donald Fraser had gone out, he had not gone into the snow. Hamish's gaze returned to the mantelpiece, to the small brass key. He turned it over in his palm, then glanced toward the old radio set by the chair. The back panel hung slightly ajar. Inside, behind the valves and wires, was a narrow compartment Hamish had never seen before. He reached in. The compartment was empty. Someone took something. Hamish said. Blair scoffed. "Took what? And where's the body?" "That's the question," Hamish replied, his voice steady. Donald Fraser didn't disappear. He was removed or persuaded to leave without opening a door or window. And whoever did it wanted us looking at the room, not what was missing. As the bells finally rang out across Lochstube, welcoming the new year at last, Hamish Macbeth stood in the silent cottage, holding a useless little key and feeling certain of one thing. This was no Hogmanay accident. It was a puzzle designed to look simple, and puzzles like that were always the most dangerous. Hamish Macbeth stayed behind after Blair ordered the cottage sealed and the villagers dispersed. The superintendent's certainty that the case would resolve itself sat heavily in the air. But Hamish knew better. Crimes that presented themselves as nothing were rarely nothing at all. He waited until the sounds of boots faded, then resumed his quiet circuit of Bray Cottage, as the place itself might speak if he listened closely enough. He returned to the radio first. The empty compartment bothered him more the longer he thought about it. Donald Fraser had been a private man, but not a secretive one. He paid his bills on time, attended Kirk without fail, and argued about sheep prices with anyone willing to listen. A hidden compartment suggested something out of character, or something he had been forced into. Hamish traced the edges of the opening and noticed a smear of soot, darker than the rest. Not old. Fresh. Someone had reached in recently, fingers blackened by the chimney or the fire. Hamish straightened and crossed back to the hearth. He crouched, peering into the ash, with the patience of a man used to sheep refusing to be hurried. Amid the grey powder lay a thin sliver of paper, half burned but not destroy. Ed. He lifted it gently with a poker. A number was still visible, written in a careful hand. Not a phone number, too short. Not a date. It meant something to someone, but not yet to him. He tucked the fragment into his notebook just as the door creaked open. Mrs. Agnes Macleod stood there, twisting her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "I thought you'd gone," she said. "Nearly," Hamish replied, "but I had a few things to check." "You were the last person to see Donald, weren't you?" She nodded quickly. "Aye. I brought him shortbread, same as every year." "And how was he?" She hesitated. Just a fraction, enough for Hamish to notice. "Fine," she said. "Quiet, but that's Donald." Hamish leaned against the table, keeping his tone mild. "Did he mention anyone calling by later?" "No," she said too quickly. "No one would. It was Hogmanay." Hamish glanced at the whisky glass. "Did he pour that, before or after you arrived?" Agnes frowned. "Before, I think. Or after." I didn't pay attention, but she would have. Agnes Macleod paid attention to everything. Hamish watched her fingers worry at her sleeve, picking at a loose thread that wasn't there. "You look cold," he said. "Sit down." She did, though she perched rather than settled. Her eyes flicked to the mantelpiece, then away. Hamish followed her glance. The brass key lay where he had placed it, catching the firelight. "Ever seen that before?" he asked. Agnes swallowed. "No." Another pause. Too long. Hamish let the sill end stretch until it became uncomfortable. Outside, a gust rattled the back door, reminding them both of the snow that bore no footprints. Donald was frightened, Agnes said suddenly. "Not of anyone. Of something." Hamish kept his voice steady. What something? He wouldn't say. Just kept asking what time it was, over and over. She pressed her lips together. "I thought it was just the bells he was worried about." Hamish nodded, though the stopped clock immediately sprang to mind. Someone had cared very much about that exact moment. "Did anyone else come by after you left?" Agnes shook her head, then stopped. "Well, no. I mean, I didn't see anyone." "That's not the same thing," Hamish said gently. Her shoulders slumped. "I saw a shadow near the back path. Thought it was nothing. Everyone was out celebrating. Did Donald see it?" "I don't know." Hamish thanked her and walked her to the door, watching as she hurried away into the dark. When she was gone, he stood for a long moment, replaying the conversation in his mind. Fear. A hidden compartment. A key no one admitted to recognizing, and a shadow no one wanted to claim. Blair returned an hour later with forms and impatience. "Still poking about?" he asked. "I've arranged for a search at first light." "Good," Hamish said. "But we should also talk to the villagers who weren't celebrating." Blair snorted. "Everyone celebrates Hogmanay." "Not everyone," Hamish replied, thinking of the shadow by the back path, of Agnes's avert, eyes, of a man who vanished without stepping into the snow. As the fire finally burned down to embers, Hamish Macbeth felt the first tug of deception tightening around the case. Someone in locked-up knew more than they were saying. He didn't yet know who or why, but the silence surrounding Donald Fraser was beginning to speak, and it was telling him this mystery had been carefully arranged to look like nothing at all. Morning crept into locked-up with a pale, uncertain light, as if even the day hesitated to intrude on what the night had hidden. Hamish Macbeth was already moving, his coat buttoned against the cold, his mind replaying fragments of the previous hours. Superintendent Blair had organized a methodical search of the surrounding fields, and Burns and uniformed officers trudged through the snow, their boots leaving the first honest tracks since Donald Fraser's disappearance. Hamish, however, turned toward the village itself. If Donald had not gone into the snow, then whatever had happened to him had begun, and perhaps ended among people who knew him well. The first door Hamish knocked on belonged to Morag Campbell, whose cottage overlooked the back path behind Bray Cottage. She greeted him with exaggerated cheer, insisting he come in, insisting on tea, insisting too quickly that she had seen nothing at all. "I was asleep before the bells," she said, pouring water that sloshed over the rim. "Too old for staying up." Hamish glanced at the clock on her wall. It read 10 p. Asked 9. Your clock stopped, he said mildly. Oh, that thing never works. Morag replied, though her eyes flicked toward it with irritation. I used the wireless for the time. And was the wireless on last night? She paused. I don't remember. Hamish thanked her and left, the scent of anxiety following him out the door. Too eager, he thought, too practised. Next was Ewan Macbeth, who lived closer to the shore and claimed to have been walking home around midnight. I heard nothing, Ewan said, folding his arms. Didn't see Donald either. But you walked past the back path? Hamish asked. Aye, in fresh snow? One hesitated. It wasn't fresh then. Must have started late. Hamish nodded, though he knew the snow had begun before 11. Ewan's gaze slid away, fixing on the window. Holding back, Hamish decided. Not lying outright, but trimming the truth. Why, late morning, patterns began to form not clear shapes, but impressions. Several villagers remembered hearing something metallic, a clink or scrape, though no one could agree when. 2 people mentioned seeing light by Donald's back door after Agnes had left, but both insisted it was probably just the fire, and nearly everyone volunteered the same conclusion without being asked. Donald Fraser had no enemies. Hamish saved Agnes MacLeod for last. He found her in her kitchen, hands deep in flour, as though grounding herself in routine. She didn't look up when he entered. I've told you everything I know, she said, perhaps. Hamish replied, but you haven't told me everything you think. She stopped kneading. Slowly she wiped her hands and met his eyes. People talk, she said. They always do. What do they say? That Donald had money hidden away. That he was saving for something, or someone. Hamish thought of the empty compartment behind the radio. Do you believe that? I believe Donald was careful, Agnes said, and that makes people curious. Did he ever mention feeling watched? She nodded once. Not watched. Pressed, like time was pushing him. The stop clock came back to Hamish again, more insistently now. Who knew his routines best? He asked. Agnes didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet. All of us. In a place like this, habits aren't private. Outside, Blair's search returned nothing but frozen ground and frustration. No body, no trail, he said. I'm telling you, Macbeth. The man wandered off. Hamish shook his head. Someone wanted us to think that. And who would go to all that trouble? Hamish thought of Morag's broken clock, Ewan's careful phrasing, Agnes's half-confession, of villagers who spoke too much and others who spoke too little. Someone with something to lose, he said, as afternoon faded. Hamish returned to Bray Cottage one last time. The silence inside felt heavier now, charged with unspoken truths. He stood by the mantelpiece, looking at the small brass key. It wasn't a door key. It wasn't decorative. It was specific, outside, void. Airs drifted past, villagers speculating, denying, reassuring one another that nothing like this could happen in Lochtub. Hamish listened, separating words from meaning. Beneath the polite concern and ready cooperation, motives shifted like ice beneath snow. Someone had helped Donald Fraser disappear. Whether by fear, persuasion, or force, Hamish did not yet know. But the contradictions were tightening, and with each careful answer and averted gaze, the village itself was beginning to confess quietly, unwillingly, to a secret it could no longer keep buried. Hamish Macbeth stayed late into the afternoon, seated at the small kitchen table in Bray Cottage, the brass key and the half-burned fragment of paper in front of him. Outside, snow swirled in lazy eddies, blanketing Lochtub in silence, but inside, the air hummed with the complexity of human motives, greed, fear, jealousy, and secrecy, all circling like shadows around the missing man. He began to lay out what he knew, quietly, mentally drawing lines between people, objects, and events, seeking the pattern hidden beneath layers of carefully staged appearances. Donald Fraser's habits were key, precise, predictable, cautious. That someone had intercepted him meant not only opportunity, but knowledge of his routines. That narrowed the circle immediately. Morag Campbell, with her overzealous cheerfulness, had been too quick to claim ignorance. Ewan Macbeth had avoided direct answers, his body tense when speaking of paths and snow. Evie and Agnes MacLeod, who seemed genuinely worried, had slipped into contradictions implying knowledge she claimed she didn't possess. Each alibi contained cracks, subtle but telling. Greed was obvious. The compartment behind the radio, the whispered rumours of savings or a hidden fortune, pointed towards someone who thought money might be at stake. But Hamish dismissed the idea of simple robbery. Whoever had moved Donald Fraser was clever enough to leave no footprints, no struggle, no trace in the snow. That was more than greed, it was planning, calculation. Someone wanted to control the narrative, to make it appear as though nothing had happened at all. Jealousy, too, lurked in the background. Hamish thought of Ewan MacPhee, always competing with Donald in minor ways: sheep prices, fishing rights, village reputation. Small rivalries might seem trivial, but they could be the spark that pushed someone into a desperate act if combined with opportunity. He considered Morag, whose loud cheerfulness might mask envy, and even Agnes, whose concern for Donald was genuine, yet who seemed to guard a personal stake in his affairs. Ear was perhaps the most dangerous motive of all. Hamish remembered her words, not watched, pressed like time was pushing him. Fear was intimate, invisible, yet it motivated people to act against their better judgment. If Donald had confided in someone, even indirectly, and that person acted out of fear of exposure, loss, or shame, it could explain the care Ken to stage his disappearance. Hamish began to sketch a map in his notebook, connecting names with events, times, and possible motives. Morag's broken clock might have been deliberate, stopping time in a symbolic gesture, or simply to confuse anyone observing. Ewan's hesitant statements suggested he wanted to withhold information without outright lying. Agnes's allusions to the hidden money and Donald's nervousness suggested she knew more than she admitted, perhaps afraid of what revealing it would unleash. Each thread alone was fragile. Together they wove a dense, tangled maze of human desire and fears. The half-burned paper fragment pulled Hamish's attention again. The number short, incomplete, could be part of a code, a key, or a date. Perhaps it was the clue that tied motive to action, the point where opportunity intersected with human emotion. Whoever held the most intimate knowledge of Donald's habits could also manipulate that information, using it to achieve whatever personal aim motivated them. Hamish rose and moved to the window, staring out at the empty streets of Lochdub. The village appeared serene, almost idyllic under the soft snow, but beneath that calm lay layers of hidden tensions, connections, and grudges. Everyone he had spoken to had a reason, some obvious, some veiled, but none told the whole truth. That was the problem. Every motive was real, but no single theory explained everything. The maze was complete, intricate, and dangerous. He turned back to the table, letting his eyes sweep over the objects once more: the brass key, the ashes, the fragment of paper. These were not merely clues, they were pieces of the puzzle that would reveal the web of deception holding Donald Fraser in place. Greed, jealousy, fear, and calculation all danced in silence, waiting for him to see how they connected. And Hamish Macbeth, with patience honed over years of unsolvable mysteries, knew that in time, tangled maze would begin to unwind, but only if he followed the threads carefully and did not allow the obvious to blind him to the subtle truths hidden beneath. By mid-afternoon, Superintendent Blair returned to Bray Cottage with a triumphant air, snow crunching beneath his boots. He carried with him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he placed on the table with a flourish. "Found this tucked behind a loose floorboard in UNMC Fee's barn," he said. A note from Donald Fraser, clearly hidden. Case solved. Hamish Macbeth peered down at the paper. It was clean, freshly written, and folded with precision. The words inside were brief. "I must leave to settle matters. Do not look for me. Trust no one." Blair grinned. There you have it. He left voluntarily. No foul play. Nothing more to investigate. He villagers breathed easy. Morag Campbell appeared at the door, cheeks flushed with excitement. "See," she said. "Nothing to fear. Donald's fine, just off somewhere." Hamish, however, felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest. Summonth. ING about the note was too neat, too deliberate. The handwriting matched Donald's, but the phrasing seemed rehearsed, almost as though written to mislead. The very act of leaving the note in a place where it would inevitably be found screamed of someone guiding the discovery. Blair noticed Hamish's hesitation. "What now?" he asked. "We wait," Hamish said slowly, "or at least we observe." As the village celebrated the apparent resolution, Hamish returned to his solitary observation. He examined the brass key again, turning it over in his hand. Its shape, its weight, the slight indentation worn into its surface, were clues that didn't fit the tidy narrative Blair had embraced. A man leaving voluntarily wouldn't leave the key behind, especially one so obviously meant to attract attention. Someone else had left it there deliberately. Hamish walked the back path, tracing the route the supposed voluntary departure would have taken. Snow had already begun to melt slightly in the sun, but he could still detect faint impressions that didn't match a single stride. Footprints diverged and converged, then disappeared. Whoever had taken Donald had done so with the same meticulous care he himself had admired in the missing man. But there was another subtle marked scuffing that suggested a struggle, a weight moved, or a concealment. Hastily yet expertly executed by evening, the villagers had fully accepted the story. Blair left, satisfied, already making plans to return to more mundane duties. Good work, Macbeth, he said with a nod, unaware that Hamish was not yet convinced. Enjoy the rest of Hogmanay. Hamish remained at Bray Cottage, staring at the stopped clock and the still smoking embers in the hearth. The paper, the key, the faint footprints, they all hinted at a more complex truth. He thought of the villagers he had spoken to, their subtle lies and evasions, their half-truths. Something had been orchestrated, and the orchestration was almost perfect. He could feel the edges of the trap, though he did not yet know its shape. As twilight fell, he heard movement outside a light, careful shuffle against the snow. Hamish slipped to the window and peered out, catching a glimpse of a shadow slipping silently between cottages. Too deliberate to be random. Too cautious to be someone merely checking on the weather. Someone was still out there, someone who knew the investigation, someone waiting. Hamish's instincts told him that the real culprit had watched every move, timed every reaction, and allowed the discovery of the note to placate the authorities while maintaining control. The village complacent believed the case closed, yet the threads he had traced, contradictory statements, concealed knowledge, the brass key, the ashes, and the fragment of paper hinted that the truth was far from resolved. Hamish Macbeth stood alone in the fading light, the cold creeping through the cottage floorboards, the sense of a trap, a staged victory pressed against him. He criminal was still in the shadows, still shaping the narrative, and Hamish knew the danger was not gone. It was waiting, and when it struck, the subtle artifice, the carefully constructed lies, and the tangled motives would converge in a moment that would leave no one unscathed and night deepen, and with it the quiet certainty that the disappearance of Donald Fraser was only the beginning, that the calm surface of Loch hid currents swift, cold, and lethal. Hamish watched, patient, alert, aware that the real game was only just beginning. Hamish Macbeth did not sleep that night. The wind rattled through the eaves of Bray Cottage, carrying the scent of melting snow and peat smoke, and with it a reminder that even in small villages like Loch, the past never truly lay dormant. He sat by the dwindling embers in the hearth, turning over every fragment of the case, the brass key, the half-burned paper, the carefully staged note, and the subtle contradictions in the villagers' statements. Something in all of it tugged at a memory, faint but insistent, from a case long closed and largely forgotten. Years ago, another disappearance had unsettled Loch. A merchant from the outskirts, someone who had dealt quietly and confidently in rare goods, vanished without a trace. The investigation at the time had fizzled into routine explanations. He had fled. He had been careless. Perhaps he had simply met with foul luck. Hamish had been a young constable then, a witness to the UNR, eveling of a mystery no one had cared to solve fully. And now, reviewing the details of Donald Fraser's case, he recognized echoes, footprints that diverged and converged, missing persons conveniently gone, notes left to mislead, small, deliberately staged items meant to draw attention to the wrong place. It wasn't just procedural echoes. There were people too. Morag Campbell, Ewan MacPhee, and even Agnes MacLeod, all names whispered, in connection with the older disappearance, if only in gossip. At the time, the village had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, letting suspicions drift like smoke and never settling firmly on anyone. Yet here they were, in this new mystery, showing the same patterns of subtle deception, withheld truths, and carefully rehearsed statements. Hamish realized with a quiet thrill that the village itself was a living repository of motives, grudges, and secrets carried over decades. He returned to the brass key, turning it over under the flickering firelight. Its worn edges hinted that it had been used, but for what? And then the memory of the merchant's disappearance surfaced. A key, small and unassuming, had been mentioned in a hushed aside, something hidden in a cabinet behind the hearth, overlooked entirely by the young constables. The past was repeating itself, or at least casting a long shadow. The key was not just a clue, it was a link, a tangible connection between the current crime and the one long buried. Hamish made a list of connections in his notebook. Ewan had once worked with Donald Fraser on minor trade deals, as had the merchant years before. Morag's family had financial entanglements reaching back decades, and Agnes, though older and quieter, had ties through friendship, marriage, and inheritance that intertwined all three. Each person carried a history of slight debts, favours, and rivalries, small, everyday matters that now aligned with the urgency of greed and fear. The current disappearance, Hamish realised, was layered atop this older web, borrowing its structure to obscure motive and opportunity. The fragments of paper resurfaced in his mind, the number, the half-burned edge. It could be part of a ledger, a code, or a list linking both the past and present disappearances. The ash, the key, even the meticulously poured whiskey, all of it seemed to echo rituals of concealment from the old case. Hamish's intuition told him the same hands were at work. Someone had learned from history, refining their methods, and the village itself had allowed these patterns to fester hidden beneath cordial smiles and seemingly innocent Hogmanay traditions. By early morning, Hamish could no longer ignore the implication. The past had not been resolved, it had been waiting for the right opportunity, the right moment to assert itself. Donald Fraser was the present incarnation of a pattern rooted decades before, a target chosen with care, his disappearance choreographed with the precision of someone who had studied old mistakes, and the villagers, whether through loyalty, fear, or habit, were complicit in ways both subtle and unmistakable. Hamish looked out at the slowly brightening streets. The snow was patchy now, footprints faint but telling, and the village held its usual quiet, oblivious to the hidden connections threading through its very foundation. He understood, finally, that solving the case would require untangling the present from the past, tracing lines of deceit across generations, and confronting truths the villagers would prefer remained buried. The shadows of the past had risen, and Hamish Macbeth, patient, watchful, and meticulous, knew that only by acknowledging them could he hope to bring Donald Fraser safely back and expose the carefully concealed hand that had orchestrated this intricate, decades-old design. Hamish Macbeth spent the morning retracing steps, circling Bray Cottage and the back path repeatedly, though he did not follow the footprints in the snow. They were too carefully laid, too deliberate, and he suspected they had been staged for any casual observer. Instead, he focused on subtler signs, the way the wind had shifted a loose shutter, the indentation in the moss beneath the frozen grass, the faint aroma of peat smoke lingering near a low hedge. All of it was minutiae most would ignore. But Hamish knew that when a crime was staged meticulously, it was. They overlooked details that cracked the case open. By mid-morning, he decided it was time a more unconventional approach. He returned to the village square, where the suspects and witnesses had begun to drift into their routines, their nerves disguised by civility. Hamish's plan was simple, if unorthodox. He would test reactions, not statements. Words could be rehearsed, alibis memorized, but instinct, even when suppressed, often betrayed the truth. He began with Agnes MacLeod, inviting her to walk with him under the guise of discussing Hogmanay preparations. Hamish casually mentioned Donald Fraser's habits, subtly fabricating small details, things he knew were false. "I heard Donald was worried about a visitor," he said. "Someone arriving late at night by the back door." Agnes's hands, resting on the basket she carried, tightened slightly. Her eyes flicked toward the snow-covered back path. "A visitor," she repeated, too sharply. "Yes," Hamish said gently, letting his tone carry no accusation. "I suppose he expected someone he knew. Someone who might influence him." She paused, swallowed, then smiled faintly, but it did not reach her eyes. Hamish noted the hesitation, the subtle flinch, the micro-expression almost invisible to anyone untrained. Something in her reaction was not alarm at speculation. It was recognition, memory, surfacing where she hoped none existed. Next, he sought Morag Campbell. She greeted him warmly, but her voice carried a touch of nervous energy, brittle as ice. Hamish mentioned the brass key. He pretended he had found another in the villa, identical to Donald's. "Curious, isn't it?" he said casually. "Some people keep sets. Small things, overlooked, but important." Morag laughed lightly, though her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shawl. "I suppose," she said, "it's just a key. Nothing more." "Ah," Hamish replied softly, leaning in just enough. "But what if the key opens something else? Something someone is very keen to hide?" The air changed around her. The laugh dissolved into silence, and her eyes darted to the nearest window, then down to the snow, then back to Hamish. That pause, fractional, almost imperceptible, spoke volumes. She had not spoken a word of falsehood, but the hesitation revealed a crack in her composure. Finally, Hamish approached Ewan MacPhee, using another tactic. He pretended to misplace the half-burned paper fragment from Donald's radio compartment, letting it fall from his notebook. as he bent to tie his boot. Yuan's reaction was instantaneous. His eyes followed the paper, his body stiffened, and his hand twitched toward it, though he did not pick it up. "Curious thing," Hamish said lightly, retrieving it. "A number, half-burned, perhaps a code, or just a distraction." Yuan's throat cleared, and he smiled, but the faintest pallor touched his cheeks. Hamish noted it. That small, involuntary reaction was a confirmation of knowledge, a subtle acknowledgement of familiarity with the fragment. A man who had no connection to the clue would have shown indifference. Why, the time the sun sank. Lo, Hamish had accumulated a map of reactions rather than statements. The unusual tactic observation, instinctual responses had revealed what careful questioning had not. The villagers' carefully constructed facades were already cracking under the pressure of subtle psychological cues. Agnes had shown recognition, Morag had betrayed guardedness, and Yuan had reacted to a clue he should not have cared about. Returning to Bray Cottage, Hamish placed the brass key and paper fragment side by side on the table. The snow outside had softened, footsteps erased, but the traces of human behaviour, instincts, reactions, unguarded movements remained etched in his mind. The unconventional approach had yielded the first real evidence that went beyond appearances. Someone had orchestrated Donald Fraser's disappearance with meticulous planning, and now, through instinct rather than words, the veil was beginning to lift. Hamish Macbeth, watching the slow fade of daylight across Lochdub, understood that the next step would require him to connect these reactions, to trace them back to opportunity and motive, and to confront the subtle, calculating hand that had manipulated the village itself. The trap had a pattern, and the first cracks were visible. All that remained was to follow them to the truth. Hamish Macbeth returned to Bray Cottage that evening with a clear plan. The morning's unconventional observations had given him a map of instinct and reaction, and he intended to cross-reference it with tangible evidence: the brass key, the half-burned paper, and the notes he had meticulously compiled from conversations and observation. He spread everything carefully across the kitchen table, letting the glow of the last embers illuminate their significance. He was just noting connections between Morag Campbell's guardedness and the key when a knock at the door startled him. It was Yuan Macbeth, appearing calm on the surface but with a subtle tension in his shoulders that Hamish had learned to recognize. "I thought I'd help," Yuan said, stepping in. "Might make sense of things if we pool what we know." Hamish did not object. Collaboration sometimes revealed more than confrontation. They sat together, examining the fragments and reviewing reactions, when the sudden noise of the front door being forced open drew Hamish to his feet. Two figures moved quickly inside, shadows against the dim firelight, and before he could react, they grabbed the half-burned paper and the brass key. Hamish lunged, but the figures slipped past him and out the back, disappearing into the deepening twilight. For a moment, Hamish could only stare at the empty space where the evidence had rested. The theft was precise, practiced, almost surgical. Someone had known exactly what items to take and when. The brass key and the fragment were not just clues, they were leverage. And now someone had moved to remove that leverage before Hamish could act. He rushed to the back path, scanning the snow foe. Footprints. Fresh prints led toward the small woods at the edge of the village, but they were faint, half erased by wind and the shifting snow. Whoever had taken the evidence had prepared for this escape, leaving only a trail that suggested movement but concealed intention. Hamish noted the direction, the spacing of the steps, the way one foot had slipped slightly on a patch of ice, a signature of urgency. The implications were immediate and chilling. Whoever had stolen the key and paper had been monitoring him, anticipating that he would connect the dots between instinct and tangible proof. They were one step ahead, shaping the case as it unfolded. Trust, Hamish realized, was now even more precarious. Anyone he had spoken to Morag, Agnes, Yuan might have been complicit, whether knowingly or under pressure. The village, which seemed quaint and quiet, now felt like a web where every strand might conceal a trap. By the time Blair arrived, summoned by the noise, Hamish had already begun reconstructing possibilities. "Someone's gone to great lengths to remove evidence," he explained, pointing to the faint tracks. "They knew what it was, and exactly where it would be." Blair frowned, a mixture of frustration and disbelief crossing his features. "Then we've got no proof at all." "Not exactly," Hamish said. "The proof isn't just the objects themselves. It's the pattern, the timing, the reactions, the instinctive tells we observed. The thief revealed themselves by the very act of Remo, Ving the evidence. Blair shook his head, muttering about wasted hours and villagers' nerves, but Hamish barely heard him. He was already considering the next step, tracing who had the knowledge, who had the opportunity, and who would risk exposing themselves so quickly after the unconventional test. The removal of the items was bold. It suggested desperation, perhaps fear that Hamish was closing in, or confidence that the detective had no backup. Hamish returned inside, pacing slowly. He replayed the events in his mind, turning over every suspect, every reaction. Morag's flinch at the mention of the key, Agnes's recognition of the fabricated visitor, Yuan's twitch at the fragment they now all took on a sharper edge. The theft had not erased the clues. It had illuminated the direction of the threat. The criminal was watching, waiting, and capable of precise, premeditated moves as the first. Stars appeared in the locked-up sky. Hamish Macbeth realized that the game had changed. The evidence could be gone. But the investigation had gained urgency. Every reaction, every instinct, every misstep would now have to be read carefully, interpreted as though each one were a piece of evidence itself. The missing paper and key had vanished, but the trail they left behind them. Subtle fingerprints of human behavior was now more critical than ever. The shadows in the village had grown bolder, and Hamish understood that to recover Donald Fraser and uncover the truth, he would have to anticipate the next move before it was made. Hamish Macbeth barely had time to consider the stolen evidence before the night itself erupted into chaos. A frantic knock at Bray Cottage's door brought him to his feet, the tension of the day snapping his nerves taut. Outside stood Morag Campbell, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "It's Agnes," she gasped. "Something's happened at her cottage. She's gone." Hamish's heart tightened. Agnes MacLeod had been careful, cautious, measured, someone who would never put herself in danger unless cornered. Yet here she was, vanished from her own home. No signs of struggle visible to anyone who had looked from the road. Morag could only stammer details. She had come to check on Agnes in the early evening, but the door had been ajar when she arrived. The house was empty. A single chair had been overturned, and the kettle was still on the stove. Water long cold. Hamish ran, Morag close behind. Through the snow-darkened streets, eyes scanning for footprints, disturbances, anything that might indicate where Agnes had gone. He paused outside her back door. Snow, deep and even, showed no tracks leading from the house. None at all. The same impossibility he had seen with Donald Fraser's disappearance pressed on him. Someone had been removed, without leaving a trace. Inside the house, Hamish moved carefully, noting subtle signs of intrusion. A faint smear of soot on the windowsill, a slight shift in the rug near the fireplace. Kettle's handle turned ever so slightly. Small things, almost invisible, yet deliberate. Whoever had taken Agnes had done so with the same meticulous planning as the earlier crime, leaving the scene staged to confuse any casual observer. The realization hit him hard. The villain was no longer just hiding, manipulating, or observing. They were escalating. If Agnes had been removed so boldly, Donald Fraser was almost certainly still at risk, and the stolen evidence, the brass key and paper fragment, was now more critical than ever. The thief had been clever enough to anticipate Hamish's tactics before, but now they had struck again, forcing him to act faster than the usual. Patient, methodical pace he favoured, Hamish returned to the village, alert for any movement, any sign that the criminal had left a trail. He noted the shadows slipping between cottages, the hush of snow muffling, footsteps, and the quiet panic rippling through Lochdob. Every resident seemed unnervingly aware, yet unwilling to speak, caught between fear and the instinct to protect themselves or someone else. By late evening, Hamish realized he could not rely solely on observation. He needed action, and he needed to anticipate the next move. He set traps not physical, but psychological, subtle signs, whispered rumors, calculated misdirections to provoke a reaction. If the villain was clever enough to remove evidence and abduct another victim, then their own instinctive reactions would betray them. Hamish had tested this before, with small hints and carefully observed responses. Now he needed a larger stage. Returning to Bray Cottage, he reviewed the sequence of events: Donald Fraser's disappearance, the stolen key and paper, and now Agnes's vanishing. The pattern was undeniable. Each act was precise, premeditated, and calculated to mislead the authorities. Blair's conventional approach had already failed, and Hamish knew he could not wait for mistakes to reveal themselves. The criminal's next move was inevitable. There was someone intimate with the village, someone who knew its rhythms, habits, and fears, Hamish set himself to prepare careful observation points, hidden signals, questions designed to provoke instinctive responses, and subtle cues in the village that might flush the criminal out. As he moved from house to house, he noticed the almost imperceptible tension among the villagers, small hesitations, fleeting eye contact, and gestures that spoke volumes. The network of lies and half-truths was tightening, and the villain's confidence now carried risk. By midnight, Lochtub was quiet again, the snow reflecting the pale moonlight. Hamish stood alone, aware of the danger surrounding him. The second disappearance had proven the stakes were higher, the criminal several steps ahead, and the clock was ticking. If he miscalculated, there would be no more victims to investigate, only bodies, and a village trapped under the weight of its own secrets. Hamish Macbeth clenched his coat around him, eyes sweeping the silent streets. The next move would come soon. He could feel it, as tangible as the frost on his boots. The unexpected twist had arrived, and with it, the urgent realization that solving this mystery was no longer about piecing together what had already happened. It was about preventing the next calamity before the shadows claimed another life. Hamish Macbeth returned to Bray Cottage in the early hours, the village under a thin veil of snow and silence. The second disappearance had rattled the villagers, but the quiet allowed him space to think. He spread out his notes, fragments of paper, the stolen brass key now recovered, through a small ruse, and his observations of instinctive reaction. Every conversation, every micro-expression, every hesitation now had weight. For the first time, amidst the chaos of two vanishings, Hamish began to see a shape emerge. It started with something almost trivial, a comment Morat Campbell had made days ago about always keeping the kitchen tidy in case someone comes to look. At the time, Hamish had dismissed it as idle chatter, an eccentricity of village life. But now, after observing how the thief had staged Donald Fraser's disappearance, and taken the key and paper with precision, the remark clicked into place. Morag's concern for appearances, her habit of noting the smallest disarray, was not just personal, it was habitual surveillance. She noticed everything, and she remembered everything. Hamish's eyes drifted to Agnes MacLeod, her subtle flinch when he mentioned the fictitious visitor. Her recognition of the brass key had hinted at knowledge she hadn't admitted. And yet, what tied it together wasn't just her reactions, it was how she moved through the village, how she positioned herself near certain cottages, and how she always seemed to be present yet unobtrusive. Combined with Morag's habits, a pattern emerged, someone who observed, catalogued, and manipulated without leaving obvious traces. He looked again at Ewan MacPhee's reaction to the half-burned fragment. It had been an involuntary flinch, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed familiarity with details he shouldn't have known. Alone, each detail could be dismissed. Together they formed a chain linking three villages with overlapping knowledge, access, and subtle influence. The crimes were not random, they were choreographed around the routines and weaknesses of the village itself. Hamish turned his attention to the small brass key once more. Its purpose had seemed mysterious, almost symbolic. And then he remembered the clock at Bray Cottage, stopped at 12 minutes past midnight. The key, when held against the compartment behind the radio, fit perfectly. Donald Fraser had been forced, or persuaded, to hide something, a ledger, money, or perhaps correspondence linking the current plot to the older disappearance years ago. The key had been left in plain sight, intended to draw attention to an innocuous object while concealing the true leverage. The last piece of the pattern came from the snow outside. The footprints and scuff marks, previously dismissed as misleading, revealed a rhythm. The same steps had appeared near Donald Fraser's back path and at Agnes's cottage, always in careful arcs, always avoiding the snow that would betray the thief's approach. Someone intimately familiar with the terrain had orchestrated these movements, and the unusual precision suggested repetition, rehearsal even. Hamish leaned back, letting the connection settle. Each subtle clue, the remarks, the habits, the reactions, the stolen evidence was a piece of a larger choreography. The villain had relied on routine, observation, and psychological manipulation. The chaos of multiple disappearances would obscure the logic behind the action, but the pattern had been there all along, hiding in plain sight for anyone patient enough to observe it. By the time the sun began to rise, painting Lochtub in pale gold, Hamish had mapped the web in his mind. The coincidences, the instinctive reactions, the careful staging, they were all deliberate. Each act, each manipulation, was aimed at controlling perception, guiding others to false conclusions, and maintaining the illusion of an unsolvable mystery. And yet, the pattern revealed the truth. A small set of villages, connected by history, opportunity, and knowledge orchestrated the disappearances with precision. Hamish stood by the window, staring out at the silent village. The chaos of the last days had been intentional, a smokescreen for someone clever enough to think several steps ahead. But now he knew the rhythm, the method, and the motives. The key to Donald Fraser's disappearance and the threat to Agnes was no longer hidden. It had been in plain sight the entire time, waiting for him to notice, and Hamish Macbeth, ever patient and meticulous, felt the first real surge of confidence that the shadow overlooked. Hadoop could be unravelled before it claimed another life. Hamish Macbeth spent the morning tracing the subtle thread he had uncovered, moving quietly through Lochtub with a notebook full of observations and a mind buzzing with connection. Every instinct, every habitual motion of the villagers, every overlooked remark from days past now formed a lattice of intent. But while the pattern had revealed who had the knowledge and access, the motive remained. Murky, something darker and more personal than simple greed or revenge. He returned to Bray Cottage and sat before the recovered brass key and the harp. Burned fragment, running the events through his mind like a slow-turning loom. Morag Campbell's obsession with appearances. Agnes MacLeod's carefully measured flint. Ewan MacFee's twitch at the fragment. They were all connected. Yes, but why? What had driven such meticulous planning, such staged vanishings, and the deliberate removal of evidence? His breakthrough came unexpectedly from something Hamish had almost dismissed, an old ledger tucked behind a false panel in the hearth at Donald Fraser's cottage. It was brittle with age, written in a meticulous hand, documenting exchanges, debts, favours, and secrets. Hamish's brow furrowed as he realized the ledger wasn't just a record of trade. It was a map of influence, small moral compromises, and hidden knowledge accumulated over decades. Names repeated, cross-referenced, small offences noted alongside larger favours. And in the margins, almost imperceptibly, were the words, "Balance must be restored." It clicked. The motive had never been money, not in the conventional sense. Nor was it mere rivalry. The crimes were about correction, about power. Yes, but the power was psychological. The villain sought to reassert control, to orchestrate balance in a world that had allowed old secrets to fester unchecked. Each disappearance, each staged clue, each manipulated reaction was designed to enforce a sense of order in the mind of the orchestrator. The ledger showed that Donald Fraser, through naivety or inadvertent action, had disrupted that balance. Agnes and Morag, the outwardly compliant and quiet, were enmeshed in a system of behaviour dictated by fear, ritual, and loyalty to a code no one outside the village would understand. Hamish's mind raced as he considered the implication. The disappearance of Donald Fraser had been the first act, a lesson in obedience, an assertion of control. The theft of the key and paper, the staging of his voluntary departure, had reinforced the illusion of randomness while masking the calculated intent. Agnes's subsequent vanishing wasn't just to intimidate Hamish. It was a demonstration, a psychological escalation to show that the rules of the village and the hidden code were absolute. The final piece fell into place when Hamish returned to Morag's cottage. She had been acting almost mechanically, her meticulous tidiness masked an obsession with order that went beyond the ordinary. Through careful questioning, subtle, indirect, and unthreatening, he learned that years ago a long-forgotten incident had disturbed the fragile hierarchy of trust and secrecy in Lochtub. Someone had crossed boundaries, broken unspoken agreements, and the orchestrator had vowed to correct the imbalance, no matter the cost. It was chilling. The villain's mind was a precise, obsessive lattice where fairness and control were defined on their own terms, and morality was subservient to order. Risk, violence, and psychological manipulation were tools, not deviation. The extremity of the measures, the disappearances, the stolen evidence, the stage clues reflected the depth of the psychological compulsion driving the crimes. Hamish realized that exposing the truth was not merely a matter of finding the missing or recovering objects. It was confronting a mindset capable of bending others to its rules without hesitation. But late afternoon, Hamish had reconstructed the villain's rationale in his own mind. Every act had been a ritualistic assertion of control. Every misdirection a reinforcement of hierarchy and obedience. The ledger, the instincts, the subtle reactions, and the carefully choreographed vanishings were all parts of a moral system that existed only in the orchestrator's mind, and in the way they had shaped the lives of those around them. Hamish stepped outside, the snow reflecting the soft light of early evening. The revelation weighed heavily, yet brought clarity. The crimes were not just calculated, they were a moral statement in an unconventional, chillingly exacting code. He knew now that stopping the villain would require more than uncovering evidence or coercing confessions. It would demand an understanding of that code and an ability to anticipate actions dictated by an almost ritualistic obsession with balance. The true motive was finally clear, and it was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Donald Fraser's disappearance, the theft of evidence, Agnes's vanishing, all of it had been orchestrated to correct an ancient psychological imbalance, and in the stillness of Lochtub, Hamish Macbeth knew that understanding this hidden motive was the only way to prevent the orchestrator from claiming another victim. Hamish Macbeth moved through the village inn, the dim glow of early evening, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The pattern was clear now, the hidden motive revealed, and he knew exactly how the orchestrator of the vanishings thought every step predictable, every move premeditated. The final act was within reach, and Hamish had spent hours arranging it. With meticulous care, using the village itself as a stage, he returned to Bray Cottage, gathering the recovered brass key, the ledger from Donald Fraser, and a carefully marked piece of paper to simulate a clue. He left the front door ajar, the flickering lamplight inside casting long shadows into the snow. The setup was subtle, nothing flashy, nothing obvious. Only the illusion that a critical piece of the puzzle was within reach, precisely the bait needed to draw the villain from hiding. Hamish then walked toward Morag Campbell's cottage, feigning routine, but his mind was alert to every shadow, every movement behind curtains or along rooftops. He knew that the orchestrator relied on observation, but he also knew that patience and careful manipulation could force a reaction. Every instinct and subtle habitual behavior had been noted. Tonight, the hunter would reveal themselves. It began with a rustle near the back hedge, a soft shift in the snow that betrayed careful movement. Hamish froze, heart steady, eyes scanning. A figure emerged, Morag, clutching a bundle close to her chest. Her posture was defensive, her gaze sharp, yet there was an unmistakable hesitation, as if uncertainty had pierced the armor of composure. "Good evening, Morag," Hamish said calmly, voice low but carrying. "I was hoping we could talk about Donald." Morag stiffened, glancing toward the darkened streets, calculating escape routes. I don't know what you mean," she said, voice shaking just slightly. Hamish took a slow step forward, keeping his tone even. "The ledger, the brass key, the half-burned fragment, they're all connected. You know it. Agnes knows it. Ewan knows it. And so does anyone who has been following the rules of balance in this village for decades." A flash of fear crossed her eyes, quickly replaced with rigid control. "Rules?" she repeated. "Ed. Balance? What are you talking about?" "The ledger," Hamish said, indicating the paper tucked under his coat. "You've been orchestrating everything according to it. Donald's disappearance, Agnes's removal, the stolen evidence. Every act has been about restoring order, punishing those who disrupted it. And now it ends tonight." Morag's face paled. For a moment, Hamish thought she might flee, but her hands trembled just enough to betray the weight of truth pressing on her. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to. It was never meant to." Hamish stepped closer, calm but firm. "I understand enough, but it's over. Donald is safe. Agnes is safe. The pattern you relied on is exposed." She made a sudden, desperate lunge toward the street, clutching the bundle, the ledger, from under her coat. Hamish anticipated the move. A quick step aside, a gentle but firm grab of her arm, and she was caught. She struggled, voice high with panic and fury, but Hamish held her with controlled strength. "You see," he said softly, "this is exactly why you failed to cover all the tracks. Fear, obsession, and ritual. You cannot control everything, even in a village like Lochtub." Morag sagged under the weight of defeat, shoulders trembling. "It was supposed to be fair," she murmured, "just balance for what was lost." Hamish's voice remained steady. "Fairness imposed by fear is still cruelty, and now you'll answer for it, but the people you threatened are safe. That's the only order that matters." By the time Blair arrived, summoned discreetly by Hamish before the confrontation, Morag was sitting on the steps, the ledger and brass key in Hamish's possession. The tension dissolved, leaving only the quiet acknowledgement of meticulous planning undone by calm observation and patient anticipation. Hamish stepped back into the moonlit snow, surveying the village. The disappearances, the stolen evidence, the psychological games, all of it had been orchestrated, and all of it had been anticipated and unravelled. The final confrontation had confirmed the truth. the villains carefully maintained. Illusion was now shattered, their desperate actions laid bare, and the fragile piece of Lochdub could finally begin to restore itself in the stillness. Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. The pieces had all fallen into place, the pattern fully revealed, and justice, though hard-won, had been restored. But even in that quiet triumph, he knew the village would carry the echoes of fear and secrecy for years to come, reminders of how easily obsession and control could twist lives, and how vigilance, patience, and subtle understanding had been the only means to preserve them. The village had settled in an uneasy calm by mid-morning, snow glinting under a pale sun, as Hamish Macbeth revived. Viewed the events in his mind. Morag Campbell was in Blair's custody, the ledger and brass key safely returned to their rightful place, and both Donald Fraser and Agnes MacLeod had been located unharmed, though visibly shaken. The villagers whispered among themselves, relief softening into chatter and gossip, and Hamish allowed himself a moment to exhale yet. Even as he moved among the cottages, a nagging feeling prickled at the edges of his awareness, a subtle dissonance that refused to settle. Something was off. The orchestration of the previous disappearances, the meticulous precision of stolen evidence, the psychological manipulation all pointed to a mind, both careful and obsessive. Morag had been clever, yes, but clever enough to account for every contingency. Hamish's instincts, honed by years of small-town mysteries, told him the answer was no. Someone else had been watching, waiting and guiding events from the shadows, perhaps even shaping Morag's action. He returned to Bray Cottage and examined the ledger once more, flipping through the brittle pages slowly. The entries were detailed, meticulous, referencing debts, favours, and small transgressions. But there was a subtle pattern he had missed in the chaos of the last days. Certain notes were written in a slightly different hand, the ink darker. In some passages, as though someone had added annotations afterward. One phrase in particular caught his eye. The final step will be unseen, yet decisive. Hamish froze. That P. Phrase wasn't Morag's style. It was precise, commanding, almost clinical. Unlike her obsessive, emotional code of balance, someone else had inserted it, someone orchestrating the larger pattern. He traced the entries carefully, comparing handwriting, phrasing, and subtle punctuation. His eyes fell on a name that had recurred innocuously throughout the ledger, Ewan Mac Fee, always present, often mentioned as a facilitator, a neighbourly observer, yet never suspected of active orchestration. Hamish's pulse quickened. Ewan had been cooperative, helpful even during the investigation, his reactions at the unconventional test seeming honest and measured. But the ledger revealed a second layer. While Morag had enacted the disappearances, Ewan had been the mastermind, the architect manipulating both the village's hidden code and the psychological triggers. He had used Morag's obsessive habits, Agnes's compliance, and even the villagers' trust to execute a plan that only now, in hindsight, could be fully appreciated. The first vanishing, the stolen evidence, Agnes's disappearance, all were designed to misdirect the detective, to make it seem that Morag acted alone, while the true hand remained unseen. Hamish's mind raced. He needed confirmation before confronting Ewan. Carefully, he returned to the paths surrounding Donald Fraser's cottage, retracing subtle movements and habitual patterns. There, faint but telling, he discovered footprints overlaying the snow in patterns that matched Nate. Morag's gait nor Agnes's. They were lighter, precise, and showed a deliberate avoidance of areas under observation. Someone had been monitoring the scene during Hamish's final confrontation with Morag, someone familiar enough with both the landscape and the villagers' routines to leave no clear evidence. He confronted Ewan in the village square, maintaining calm composure as he approached. Ewan's face, usually impassive, betrayed a flicker of tension. "Mr. Macbeth," he said, voice steady but carrying a subtle edge, "I thought Morag had handled things." Hamish tilted his head, expression mild, voice even. "She acted, yes, but under direction. The ledger, the annotations, the hidden steps carefully executed, but ultimately revealing your hand. You orchestrated the disappearances, manipulated the villagers, and created a pattern to mislead me." Ewan's eyes widened for just a fraction of a second, enough to confirm Hamish's suspicion. He took a slow step back, attempting to mask the alarm with composure. "You can't prove anything," he said. "Everything Morag did. It was her choice. I merely advised." "Advice doesn't explain the ledger, the added notes, or the orchestrated timing," Hamish replied, calm yet unwavering. "You hid behind her obsession, and you assumed even I wouldn't notice the subtle inconsistencies. But I did, and now you're caught. For a heartbeat, Ewan considered a desperate move, eyes flicking toward the edge of the square, toward the snow-laden paths he might have used for escape. But Hamish's careful positioning, his knowledge of the terrain, and the awareness of potential witnesses left no viable route. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the control that Ewan had exercised over the village and the events of the last week began to crumble. Hamish's calm, meticulous approach had revealed what no single act of evidence could: the true mind behind the orchestrated chaos. The last-minute twist, hidden in annotations, faint footprints, and the interplay of habits and instinct, had confirmed that the danger had not fully passed. The case, seemingly resolved with Morag's capture, had only revealed the first layer, and now the mastermind stood before him, their carefully constructed illusion finally exposed, as the wind swept across the square, and the villagers watched from a distance. Hamish Macbeth knew the final challenge lay ahead, not just to arrest, but to dismantle the psychological control that had allowed the crimes to unfold, and to ensure that the delicate balance of Lochtub could survive the revelation of the real orchestrator. The game was over, but the consequences and the relief were only beginning. Hamish Macbeth kept his gaze steady on Ewan MacPhee, watching for any sign of sudden movement. The snow-crusted village square was quiet, every shuttered window and frozen eave amplifying the tension. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the entire village held its breath. The events of the past days condensed into a single Evie Pausa. Ewan's mask of calm faltered for the first time, the faintest twitch at the corner of his eye betraying panic under the surface. You thought Morag acted alone, Hamish said slowly, voice measured, letting each word settle. You relied on the villagers' habits, their routines, even their trust. You calculated that misdirection, chaos, and carefully staged evidence would keep me chasing shadows while the real orchestrator remained invisible. Ewan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was a shield, but it couldn't hide the truth that Hamish already knew. The ledger, the annotations in a different hand, the pattern of movement across snow and shadow, and the subtle instinctive tells he had observed all pointed directly to him. You staged the disappearances, Hamish continued. Donald Fraser, the stolen key and fragment, Agnes. Each act a piece of the pattern you meticulously planned. You exploited Morag's obsession with order, Agnes's compliance. Even Ewan, no, not even Ewan. You used all of them to create the illusion of independent action while remaining several steps ahead. Ewan's hand twitched toward the ledger hidden under his coat, and Hamish anticipated it, stepping forward just enough to block the movement. "Don't," he said quietly. "Every step, every detail, every micro-reaction has been noted. You've underestimated the snow, the shadows, and the instincts of those who observe." Hamish reached into his coat and retrieved the ledger, showing EUA. And the distinct difference in handwriting the annotations in a darker ink that revealed careful orchestration. "This is the final clue," he said. "Every misdirected piece of evidence, every staged reaction points to you. The rhythm of footprints at Donald Fraser's cottage, the timing of Agnes's disappearance, pattern of attention paid to minor details, it all matches your presence, your manipulation." Ewan's face paled, but pride and desperation warred in his expression. "Even if you have proof," he whispered, "you can't stop the balance. I can still finish it." "I can." But before he could act, a sudden commotion drew his attention, a shadow moving along the far edge of the square. Hamish, who had anticipated multiple contingencies, instinctively stepped back, giving Ewan a fraction of space, and the man took it. He bolted, darting toward the frozen riverbank, disappearing over a rise before anyone could intercept. The villagers gasped, the sudden action shattering the tense calm. Hamish pursued, but the snow and uneven terrain slowed him. By the time he reached the edge of the river, Ewan was gone, leaving only disturbed snow, a faint echo of hurried footprints, and the lingering sense of unfinished business. Hamish stopped, chest heaving, scanning the dim horizon. The orchestrator had escaped, slipping into the shadows that had sustained him for so long. Returning to the village square, Hamish addressed the gathered villagers, their relief now tempered with unease. "Orag Campbell has confessed and will face justice," he said. "The ledger and other evidence have revealed the web of manipulation, and we now understand the full scope of the plan." He gestured to the ledger, the brass key, and the recovered fragments. Every clue had a purpose: the half-burned paper, the unusual reactions, the staged footprint. Even the seemingly trivial remarks each was a breadcrumb leading to the orchestrator. Only careful observation, patient deduction, and attention to instinct revealed the full picture. The villagers murmured among themselves, a mixture of awe and lingering tension. They had seen the crimes, felt the fear, and now witnessed the truth. But the escape of Ewan Macfie left a shadow over their relief. Hamish's eyes, calm yet alert, met theirs. Sometimes, he said softly, justice is delayed, not denied. The true mind behind this will be found, and when that happens, the evidence, the pattern, and the instincts that revealed them will ensure that Loch Dob's peace is restored. He gathered the ledger and key, careful to secure what remained, and allowed himself a measured breath. The case, though unresolved in one critical aspect, had been illuminated, the pattern exposed, the motives revealed, and the criminal psychology laid bare. The escape was unsettling, but Hamish Macbeth had proven once again that even the most meticulous villain could not outmatch careful observation, patient deduction, and the subtle art of noticing what everyone else overlooked. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over Loch Dob. Hamish paused, looking across the silent village, feeling the weight of the snow and the vigilance it symbolized. Justice had been partially served, but the last step remained, one that would require patience, cunning, and an unwavering eye for the patterns that others missed. In the quiet, he allowed himself a faint, knowing smile. The game was not over. It never truly was. The snow had settled into a soft, even blanket over Loch Dob, reflecting the pale light of dawn as Hamish Macbeth walked slowly through the village streets. The ledger was safely returned to Donald Fraser's custody. Agnes had resumed her cautious routines, and Morag Campbell was under official supervision, awaiting formal questioning and the consequences of her actions. The visible threat had been neutralized, but Hamish knew, as he always did, that appearances were only part of the story. He paused at the edge of the village, where the frozen river glimmered under the rising sun. The wind carried the faint scent of peat and smoke, comforting yet sharp, a reminder that Loch Dob was a village accustomed to secrets, to patterns that hid beneath the ordinary. He replayed the events of the past days in his mind, the staged disappearances, the theft and recovery of evidence, the instinctive reactions of the villagers, the subtle clues that had revealed Morag's obsession, and finally Ewan's hidden orchestration. Yet even with the primary threat exposed, a small, nagging unease remained. The ledger had shown annotations in Ewan Macfie's hand. Yes, but there had been a final note, almost imperceptible, in faded ink, tucked between pages of mundane entries. The unseen hand guides the next. Hamish had noticed it only in the quiet aftermath. After the rush of confrontation had passed, it suggested that Ewan's influence, or that of someone else equally cunning, might extend beyond the actions he had already taken. Hamish's steps carried him past familiar cottages, where windows glimmered with the early light. Even the villagers' expressions, a mix of relief and lingering anxiety, hinted that they were aware, at some level, of dangers yet unspoken. There had been moments in the investigation, small gestures, fleeting glances, that had never fully made sense. Why had Ewan reacted so subtly at the initial test with the half-burned fragment? Why had certain shadows in the village seemed to move independently of any observer? These minor details, once dismissed, now seemed almost intentional, part of a broader design that Hamish had only partially revealed. He stopped by the small bridge overlooking the river, leaning against the frozen railing. His breath formed misty clouds, each one dissipating quickly into the cold air. The village seemed peaceful, yet the balance of power and secrecy had shifted only temporarily. He recalled the cryptic phrase again, "The unseen hand guides the next." Hamish's mind traced the possibilities. Another accomplice, someone who had remained hidden, someone with knowledge of the village and its routine. Or perhaps Ewan himself had planned contingencies to ensure that even his capture would not conclude the story entirely. The detective's eyes scanned the snow-dusted paths below, noting slight irregularity, footprints partially erased, subtle depressions in the moss near the cottages, and a faint trace of a disturbance at the edge of the wood, where the wind had already begun to drift it away. Each minor anomaly was insignificant in isolation, but in the context of the village's recent history they carried weight. Hamish knew that a truly cunning mind often left only the smallest hint, trusting that the untrained eye would overlook it, and that was precisely the kind of detail he would never miss. A quiet satisfaction mingled with vigilance. The immediate danger was neutralized, the missing returned, the villain revealed, the ledger secured. Yet, as Hamish walked toward the centre of the village, where the faint glow of smoke and early activity suggested normal life resuming. He felt the weight of anticipation. Lockdoub had survived the immediate threat, but the unresolved fragments, the cryptic message, and the subtle anomalies reminded him and anyone watching that a mystery never truly ends. Reaching the village square, Hamish paused, allowing his gaze to sweep over familiar faces, quiet streets, and the distant hills beyond. He adjusted his coat against the wind and allowed himself a moment to exhale. The case had been unrailed, the orchestrator revealed, yet the faint whisper of unanswered questions remained in the cold morning air. Somewhere in the village, or perhaps beyond it, the unseen hand might still move, the pattern continuing in ways only the most patient observer could discern. Hamish Macbeth turned from the square, walking slowly toward the open moorland beyond Lockdoub. Behind him, the village resumed its rhythms, unaware of the faint, lingering presence of secrets yet unsolved. And as he disappeared into the distance, the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots echoed like a promise that even when justice is served, even when villains are exposed, the mysteries of Lockdoub and the ingenuity of its most subtle minds would endure. The case was closed for now, but the game, as always, was never truly over.